rushing the hire is almost always a recipe to screw it up. Almost always. Your staff needs to see that you're someone who's willing to have the courage to deal with the hard stuff. If you skirt or hide from the tough stuff, what kind of culture are you building in your company? How is that serving you? How is that serving your other team members, their families? It's not. You got to deal with the tough stuff. The best business owners I know, the ones that ride up the top part of this curve, they're the ones that deal with the tough stuff directly, professionally, but with courage.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Welcome to The Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel. In this week's episode, I want to talk about a question that many of our coaching clients have, which is, did I make that hire right? Did I screw up or mess up that hire? And if I did mess up that hire, what do I do about it? So this idea of how do you make sure that you hire right? That's what we're going to be focusing on this week's episode. And it comes from a tale of two clients. So the first client, I'm going to call her Susan, because I'm going to change names here. Susan had sent me an email about how she made a great hire for a director of operations. And she was really pleased with that hire. So she says, quote, "She is fantastic," close quote. Matter of fact, she is so good that she's actually going to use this new hire to help be the foundation to now allow her, Susan, to open up a second location for her business, which is a big deal for her. And I think that's great. Now, I want to contrast that to another one of our clients who has a business. The business is over $20 million a year in revenue, and Susan's business is a bit under that, right? But in this case, we're going to talk about Carlos. And in Carlos' business, he's had a challenge where we're discovering as part of the coaching process that he's made a number of hires over the past several years before he ever started coaching, and some afterwards, but mostly beforehand, that weren't really the strongest hires. So he made some mistakes. He screwed up how he used to do hiring. And what do you do about it? So first of all, let's start with the question. And the question I'm going to start with is why? Why do people screw up hiring? What are the biggest, most common reasons where people get hiring wrong? And I think that's an important question to start with. So let's start with that. The first and the biggest reason is they rush the process. They say, I've got to find this person. And what they do is they fall prey right into the second one, which is they try to hire, I'll call it on the spot. And I'll tell you what I mean by that here in a moment. They try to hire on the spot. So rushing the hire means, for example, oh man, we just lost a team member. We lost Tina, who used to be our director of operations. We need to immediately hire a new director of operations. Or, hey, we're growing so fast, we don't have a director of operations. We have to have somebody. And you can almost feel the sense of urgency in the business owner's voice when she's talking about it. You can hear the desperation as he says what he's saying about it. And so rushing the hire is almost always a recipe to screw it up. Almost always. Matter of fact, I'm going to share with you today a reminder about something I've done in an earlier podcast. I'm going to give you a reminder about how can you invest just 1 hour that's going to give you 100 to 1,000 times the return of saved time later on, because it increases your odds of not screwing up the hire. And this is something I've given as coaching advice to 5,000 business coaching people out there in the world, clients that we've worked with on big and small engagement practices. So it works. So I'll come back to that as well. So rushing the hire is, the big part is, you don't really take time to step back and decide exactly who do I really need to perform what role, to get really clear on that. And I'll go through a more structured way about that. It takes you an hour. It's all it takes you. And once you get good at it and your business gets disciplined about it, oftentimes you don't even need to take an hour. Why? Because if I'm rehiring for that director of operations and I've used that hour the first time when I made the hire, 7 years ago, 4 years ago, I might have to update it, but I'm not starting from scratch. The first time I do it takes me an hour probably. when I'm going to rehire for a role I've already done the work for, it might only take me half an hour to update what's already there, to clarify and get it cleanly in my mind. The on the spot means this. I saw Carlos do this very thing. He knew he needed a key controller in his business because the business was scaling rapidly. And so he turned to his recruiter and said, help me find a great controller. And she brought him a candidate. And he interviewed the candidate and he hired the candidate because the candidate was strong in the interview. That's not a best practice. I don't want to hire that way. The best practice, which is what we'll call the gold standard of hiring, is that I want to get to the point where I have ideally 3 very strong candidates as my finalist, each of whom have the most important must-haves to be successful in the role, and each of whom do in fact want the role, want the position with your company. From that place, I can make the best choice of those 3, but if I'm only looking at one, my chances of making a good hire go down. But if I'm looking at 3 very strong candidates, all of whom want it, it's easier to pick the best of the 3 because I have at least a reference point, a reference range from the other candidates. If I hire just on the spot, hey, they seemed great, I don't have that reference range as easily. Now, there are 2 exceptions to this. Number 1, there are occasions where you just don't have enough candidate pool, where you don't have the luxury of having 3 strong candidates to choose from. One of our coaching clients, Thomas, runs a specialty manufacturing business, and in his niche industry, he's consistently struggling to find really good operators for his line of equipment. It's really difficult to do. He's not going to find 3 highly qualified candidates, each of whom want it. But on the flip side, the second caveat here says, if it's a position I've hired for again and again, like for him, line operators is in a position that he knows about, then at least because I'm regularly interviewing and hiring for that role, I might need 3 of those people. I might need 33 of those people. I might need 333 of those people over time. I've got a reference range that lets me know that I can compare this new on-the-spot candidate to my historic people that work for me or I've interviewed. If it's the only time I'm interviewing for a brand new role and I only have one person to go from, it's a real crapshoot. Your odds of success go way down. So in general, I want to get to my gold standard 3 finalists, but there are some times in some situations that that's not a luxury you're going to be able to have. If you don't have that luxury, at least hopefully you'll have other people you've hired for that same role that provide a reference range for you so you can determine good or bad for that interview candidate. Worst comes to worst, you don't have that, you're making the hire, just know that your odds of success are less, so I'm going to have to be really good about managing that on board to keep close attention to that person so that if they're not performing, I can step in early and have adult conversations to kind of kick them a little bit to spark them to perform at their best. And if they're still not doing what I need to get done, I can cut my losses after 3 months, 6 months, not after 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. So first reason why people get it wrong is they rush it. The second reason is on the spot. The third reason people get that hire wrong is they have no structure for how they actually do the interview and selection process, right? I've talked about that on other podcast episodes. I'm not going to get into that one here today. So what's this magic 1 hour we're talking about to get clear? First of all, I need to have a very clear picture of what exactly is the role. What's the job description? And part of that needs to say, of all the things that person does, of all the 15, 20 responsibilities and tasks that are on their plate, what are the top 2 or 3 ways that this person delivers value to the business in this role? An operations director of operations might be, you deliver value to our company by making sure that orders get shipped on time every time. Or you might say by making sure that we schedule work such that we manage overtime. One of our most expensive cost of goods sold elements is overtime. And so you have to manage our labor force so we don't have overtime. We produce without having overtime. Or you might say that this person's, one of the ways they create the most value is by protecting our gross profit margin. Hey, if our gross profit margin stays at 64% or higher, you're doing great. If that number stays at 68% or higher, you're doing world class, right? You're giving them a way for them to say, this is how you contribute the most value. And how do you and the company know that value is actually created? How do we know, and how do you know that you're performing this role really well? I decide on that up front before I ever make the hire. And from there, now I can get a very clear picture of who exactly do I need to do that role really well. And what will happen is, and I see this all the time, you'll come up with this laundry list of what you're looking for. That laundry list will say, I'm looking for someone who has this, 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 and you'll have like 15 things that you want. It's really hard to hire for that specific, that many good qualities. So I tell people, boil it down. What are the 5 non-negotiable must-haves for this person to be successful in this role for your company? 5. I can go after 5, maybe 6, but I cannot go after 16. Can't do it. Probably can't even go after 7 or 9. I can't go after a left-handed trilingual person who's had 30 years of experience here and is creative, blah, 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 blah. I can't do that. I have to narrow my scope of what matters most. If I get lucky and get all my must-haves and some other stuff, wonderful. But these are the non-negotiables. And then I make sure my structured approach of hiring is all about selecting based on these must-haves. So if I do that, I'm in really good stead. So let's build with this now. So how do I know if I've made a bad hire? How do I know if I've screwed it up? How do I know? So now that I know when I hire for the role, for example, my director of operations, if I know that my must-haves, I've got 5 must-haves, the easiest way for me to know if I made a bad hire is to simply go back to that person. Let's say Carlos hired Joe. And I can say, Joe, here are the must-haves. I'm just doing this privately myself without Joe there. These are the must-haves that I hired for Joe, and I can grade him 1 to 5 on each of these. And if, as I grade him 1 to 5, having now worked with Joe for the last 6 months, and if my scores are consistently coming up 3s and 2s and maybe 1 4, then 3, then a 3. If I've got 3 2 4 3 3, you made a pretty mediocre hire with that part. I want to see 4s and 5s across the board. So I made a bad hire probably. I can also ask a very telling question. Knowing all I know about Joe today, having worked with him for the last 6 months, if I were hiring for the position today, would I hire Joe? If the answer is I would not hire Joe today, you've made a bad choice. And I'll give you one more way of doing this for the ones that are emotionally difficult. This happens. Like I talked to a business owner, Carlos in this example, and he says something like, well, Joe's worked for me now for 8 years. He's been loyal. He gives me his best efforts. And I ask a different question if I'm the coach in that situation. I say to Carlos, Carlos, if Joe came to you tomorrow morning and said, hey, Carlos, thank you for the last 8 years of working together. I found another opportunity. I've made arrangements that I'm going to give you 90 days, so 3 months notice. But at the end of those 3 months, I'm going to go work for that other company and be out of here. If you in your heart of hearts would be actually happy that Joe made this decision to leave because you didn't want to have to deal with it, that's a great clue that you need to do something about that Joe's the wrong hire. Those are 3 different ways to tell that you made a mistake with the hire or you have the wrong person. And so most business owners, and again, I've coached tens of thousands of business owners over the last almost 30 years. And I'll tell you that most business owners, and even myself included, we don't like dealing with the hard people stuff. And so we try to live with it. We try to put it out of our consciousness long enough that we can ignore it. We put our heads in the sand. And if you're serious about scaling your company, and if you're not, why are you listening to this podcast, right? This podcast is all about how do I grow my business and scale it, and at the same time make it more independent of me or any one person, so I truly build a scalable, sustainable, owner-independent company, a level 3 business. If you're not serious about that, why are you even listening? But if you are, you need to deal with the tough stuff. You're not doing Joe a favor by keeping him in a role that he's not being successful for. You need to be willing to deal with that. And let me share it with you this way. So you might have hired Joe, And Joe might be exactly who you needed for the role that you had yesterday. Once upon a time ago, Joe was exactly the guy you needed. But when you look at today, Joe is kind of the person you need for today. He's got some strengths, but he's got some real weaknesses that you're having to cover. So he's not a great choice for you today. But now this gets even worse, because when you look at Joe and what you're going to need tomorrow in the business in 6 months or 12 months or 24 months, and you look at that and you think, you know what? Joe is not the right person that I'm going to need down the road. If I don't deal with that situation, I'm saying to everyone who works for me, everyone who counts on me, relies on this business to be successful, what I'm saying to them is, I'm not willing to deal with the tough stuff. And that's not what you want as a role model, as a leader. You want to be willing to deal with the tough stuff. That's what leaders do. Leaders deal with the tough stuff. And in this case, it doesn't mean I go to Joe right now and say, hey, Joe, I'm going to need to let you go. It doesn't mean that. But I need to put a plan in place so that over the course of a period of time, whether that's 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, but somewhere in that period of time, I've got a plan in place that's going to either put Joe into a role where he's being successful for the company, or I'm going to backfill and replace Joe, and I'm going to help Joe find another company that he can be successful working. I'm going to free him up to work somewhere else. You cannot afford to keep Joe in a role that he's only so-so or adequate at long term, especially if you've got a business that's growing and scaling. If your company is growing and scaling, you absolutely need someone who's solid today, not adequate, and you need to plan far enough ahead of time that the person that you have for tomorrow is in fact a really strong person. And this conversation is really hard. One of the things I know when I coach clients that they appreciate, that one of the most important elements of that is they just need to have someone from the outside that they can have this conversation with. I was talking with a business owner earlier this very week about the same thing. He had a guy who was running his operations. The guy's number 2 was stronger than his number 1. And yet the guy had something really valuable to offer the business, but it wasn't in the role he was heading towards. They needed to make a change about that, right? You've got to have the courage to do those things, to look at and to acknowledge those parts. And if you've noticed that, you can ask yourself, is there another role that Joe can create real value for the company that the company needs? If there is no other role that the company needs, and Joe isn't good in the role he has right now, then Joe can't stay with you, right? Now, you don't have to make the decision that today you're going to do it, but somewhere over the next 30, 60, 90 days, 120 days longest, if you're in that situation, you need to do something about it. You need to deal with it. Your staff needs to see that you're someone who's going to willing to have the courage to deal with the hard stuff. If you skirt or hide from the tough stuff, what kind of culture are you building in your company? How is that serving you? How is that serving your other team members, their families? It's not. You got to deal with the tough stuff. This is the part of business that's hard. And that's why you as the owner make the earning that you do. Many business owners might earn, clients who earn $500,000, $1 million, $5 million, $10 million or more of profit a year. This is why, because you're willing to deal with the tough stuff. If you don't, you get stuck back on the earlier part of that growth curve and you never make it up the scaling curve. Because to make it up the scaling curve, you've got to deal with the tough stuff. So you have to ask yourself, does the person I have, is he or she right for who I need today? One of the mechanisms to ask that question is to give them a 1 to 5 on the position must-haves. That's one way to do that. Another is to ask if this person if I were hiring for this role again today, would I hire this person? If the answer is no on that, you have the wrong person. And again, you might have had the right person for what you needed a year ago, 5 years ago, but your business as it grows up that scaling curve, roles and positions change. And you can't carry someone who doesn't do what you need them to do. And the hardest time is when it's someone who has a great attitude, has a great commitment and loyalty, but they just don't have the capabilities that you need. For those people, you have to ask, is there another role that is valuable for the company that the company needs that they can transition into, freeing up for the other? I was coaching one of our larger clients, a client that has a company that's over 50 million a year. And as I was talking with her, she had someone who was leading an area of her company, a department of her company. And probably over the course of 3 years, 5 years or so, this person could have developed into that person she needed. But she was growing at over 25% per year. She couldn't wait the 3 to 5 years for this person to develop. So she had to bring in a new leader for that area. She kept the other person. He was very good at what he did. And likely he'll be a very good second generation leader to be the backup for that first person. But the best business owners I know, the ones that ride up the top part of this curve, they're the ones that deal with the tough stuff directly, professionally, but with courage, So I hope today was a wake-up call for you, right? So how do you know if you screwed up a past hire? Well, now you've got some tools in your toolbox about that. How do you avoid doing that? You do the gold standard way if you get very clear on who do I need to hire, including how they create the most value and how they and the company will measure that value and know that they're doing a great job. You boil that down in the candidate profile to who you need. These are the absolute non-negotiable must-haves, and you let that be part of your structure process for hire. And then when you have this person who's with you, you have to ask the question on a regular basis, not weekly, not monthly, but certainly every 3 to 6 months. Does the person I have in this role, are they doing a great job? If they're not, I need to quantify and determine how I think they're performing. I need to ask perhaps one of those other questions. If they were to come to me tomorrow and say, hey, I'm going to be leaving the company in 3 months. Thank you for all you've done. I'll make sure the transition happens smoothly. If you in your heart of hearts would be pleased, happy, appreciative of that, then you probably have the wrong hire. And then I have to also make the distinction that who I needed yesterday might not be who I need today. Plus, who I have today might not be who I'll need tomorrow. And the more my company is growing on that scaling curve, the more likely that the person I used to need is not who I need today, and the person I have today is probably not who I need in the future. And so I need to be able to proactively think that through so I can plan for that in advance and have the courage to deal with those things. All right. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Business Coach. If you got something valuable, please pass on this podcast to somebody else. Send the link to someone else. If you know of a business owner who's struggling with this very thing that we've talked about in this episode, send her or send him a link to this episode, right? Share the word. We want to build this community together. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week ahead, and I'll see you next week.